It was a bright morning when the Thompson family boarded the plane for what they hoped would be the perfect vacation. Mrs. Thompson, a hard-working mother, had managed to save up enough money to treat her children, Kira and Jamal, to an upgrade to first class. The kids had never experienced anything beyond economy class, and their excitement was nearly palpable as they stepped into the luxurious cabin. Their eyes sparkled at the spacious seats, the soft pillows, and the gleaming trays that waited for them. They settled into their seats, Jamal on the window side, Kira next to him, and Mrs. Thompson by the aisle. The flight attendants were busy preparing for takeoff, ensuring that all the passengers were comfortable. Mrs. Thompson smiled as she watched her kids explore the wonders of first class. This was supposed to be a special treat, a chance to make lasting memories before the daily routine of work and school took over again. However, as the family got settled in, they began to notice something unusual. A flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s with a perfectly groomed appearance, seemed to be watching them a little too closely. At first, Mrs. Thompson thought it was just a coincidence, a passing glance perhaps. But as time went on, it became clear that this particular flight attendant was paying much more attention to them than to the other passengers. Mrs. Thompson's initial feeling was one of discomfort, though she didn't want to jump to conclusions. It was possible, she thought, that the flight attendant was simply busy or had a lot on her mind. But as the minutes ticked by and the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension between them grew more noticeable. The flight attendant's eyes followed the children's every move, her gaze cold and calculating. As the plane taxied down the runway, the attendant made her way toward the Thompson family, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She greeted the passengers in a polite but distant manner, her smile almost forced. Mrs. Thompson returned the greeting warmly, but the flight attendant's eyes barely met hers. Instead, she focused on Kira and Jamal, giving them a quick once-over, as if scrutinizing every little detail about them. When the flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin crew began their meal service. Mrs. Thompson, feeling the weight of the flight attendant's watchful eyes, tried her best to keep the mood light. She handed Jamal this meal and smiled at Kira, reminding her to chew slowly. She tried to enjoy the flight as much as possible, but the awkwardness in the air made it difficult to relax. The flight attendant returned with the drink cart and stopped at their row. She glanced down at the children, but said nothing to them directly. Instead, she turned to Mrs. Thompson, her voice cold as she asked if she needed anything. Mrs. Thompson politely declined, trying to keep the interaction brief, but the attendant lingered a little too long. Something felt off, and Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. She glanced at the children, who were busy with their meals, trying to make the best of the situation. Mrs. Thompson, ever the optimist, told herself that it was probably nothing, a misunderstanding, a coincidence, but deep down, she felt a nagging sense that there was more to it than just a chilly attitude. As the flight continued, Mrs. Thompson tried her best to ignore the discomfort, but she couldn't help but wonder, what had caused this strange tension? What was it about her family that had drawn such cold treatment from the flight attendant? Little did she know, this seemingly innocent flight would soon take a dramatic turn, and the consequences of the flight attendant's behavior would unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. As the flight continued, the tension in the air grew. Mrs. Thompson tried to remain calm, focusing on her children, who were happily eating their meals and talking about their plans for the vacation. Kira was chattering away, her eyes wide with excitement about the places they would visit. Jamal, on the other hand, was quietly enjoying his food, occasionally glancing out the window, taking in the clouds and the vast sky outside. But all the while, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time she looked up, she noticed the flight attendant watching them again, always from a distance, but always with a certain coldness in her eyes. It was subtle at first, but over time, it became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Thompson could feel the flight attendant's gaze as she passed by, her steps measured and deliberate, The woman never made eye contact with Mrs. Thompson, but instead, her attention seemed to focus entirely on the children. At one point, the flight attendant approached their row again, this time with a drink cart. She stopped in front of them, her eyes narrowing as she scanned Kira and Jamal. Her voice, though polite, had an edge to it. "Is everything to your liking?" she asked Mrs. Thompson, not even acknowledging the children. "Yes, thank you," Mrs. Thompson replied, trying to sound as neutral as possible. She wanted to avoid any confrontation, not wanting to ruin the pleasant atmosphere she hoped for during their flight. But the flight attendant wasn't done. As she handed the drinks to Mrs. Thompson, she made a pointed remark to Kira. "Make sure you stay seated properly, sweetie. We don't want anyone getting hurt." Kira, confused and a little startled by the comment, quickly straightened up, though she hadn't been doing anything wrong. Mrs. Thompson, trying to maintain a friendly tone, smiled and said, "She's just fine, thank you." But the flight attendant didn't smile back. Her face remained blank, as if she wasn't interested in offering any kindness. The air in the cabin seemed to grow colder with each passing moment. Mrs. Thompson watched as the flight attendant moved on to the next passenger, her eyes flicking back to her children one last time before she disappeared down the aisle. Jamal, who had been watching the interaction closely, whispered to his mother, "Mom, why is she looking at us like that?" Mrs. Thompson felt a pang in her heart. She had hoped that this experience would be a nice one for her children, a moment where they could feel special. Instead, her son was already picking up on the tension, which made her feel even more uncomfortable. "Don't worry, sweetie," she said, trying to reassure him with a gentle voice. "Maybe she's just busy." But deep down, Mrs. Thompson knew it wasn't just business. It was something else. The way the flight attendant had looked at her children, it wasn't just indifference. It was something more, something that made her feel uneasy, as though her family didn't belong in that section of the plane. She couldn't understand why it was happening. After all, they had paid for their tickets, just like everyone else. There was no reason they should be treated differently. Her thoughts were interrupted by the announcement that the plane was approaching cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign would soon be turned off. As the plane leveled out, the cabin crew began their in-flight service. But Mrs. Thompson's mind was still focused on the unsettling interaction. She glanced at her children, watching their innocent smiles, and felt a growing sense of determination. She wasn't going to let this awkwardness ruin their flight. She'd find a way to make sure they enjoyed this trip, no matter what. But the flight attendant's behavior was starting to make that seem increasingly difficult. As the flight continued its journey, the uneasy feeling in the cabin only seemed to grow. Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but notice the flight attendant's continued coldness toward her family. She had hoped it was just a one-time thing, but it was clear now that this behavior was not going away. The way the flight attendant kept watching her children with such sharp, almost judgmental eyes was unsettling. The cabin had quieted down, and most passengers were either napping or reading their in-flight magazines. Kira and Jamal, however, were still wide awake, chatting excitedly about the places they hoped to visit. Mrs. Thompson tried to ignore the tension and focus on her children's enthusiasm, but it was hard to shake the feeling that they weren't as welcome in first class as everyone else. Then, just as Mrs. Thompson was about to turn her attention back to the kids, the flight attendant appeared again, this time carrying a tray of drinks. She walked toward them, her eyes locked onto the children. Mrs. Thompson tried to smile and greet her, but the flight attendant barely acknowledged her. Instead, she stopped directly in front of the children. "Are you two enjoying your drinks?" she asked, her voice colder than before. Kira, who had been sipping her juice, looked up at the flight attendant with a nervous smile and nodded. Jamal, still looking out the window, didn't seem to notice the tension in the air. Mrs. Thompson could see her children starting to feel uncomfortable, and she could tell that the flight attendant's behavior was beginning to have an effect on them. As the flight attendant handed out the drinks to the other passengers, Mrs. Thompson overheard some murmurs. A few passengers nearby glanced over at her family, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart sink. It was one thing to deal with the uncomfortable behavior from the flight attendant, but now she realized that others were noticing too. The sense of judgment in the air was palpable, and it made her feel isolated in a place that should have been comfortable and relaxing. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to their row. She gave the children another stern look, as if expecting them to do something wrong. This time, she directed her gaze at Mrs. Thompson. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge of impatience. Mrs. Thompson, feeling the weight of the flight attendant's attitude, responded politely but firmly, "No, we're fine. Thank you." She could feel her patience wearing thin. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she felt like she was being treated as though she and her children were out of place. It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair. Kira, sensing her mother's growing discomfort, reached out and held her hand. Mrs. Thompson squeezed her daughter's hand back, grateful for the gesture. Jamal, noticing the tension in the air, leaned closer to his mother and whispered, "Mom, why does she keep looking at us like that?" His voice was soft, but Mrs. Thompson could hear the hurt in his words. It was clear that the children were beginning to pick up on the negative energy too. At that moment, Mrs. Thompson knew she had to do something. She couldn't let this continue. Her children deserved to enjoy their experience, and she wasn't going to let anyone make them feel unwelcome. The flight was far from over, but she felt a sense of determination rise within her. She had to stand up for her family, no matter how difficult it might be. Mrs. Thompson's mind was racing, her thoughts caught between the need to protect her children and the desire to avoid causing a scene. She had tried to stay calm, thinking that perhaps the flight attendant's behavior was just a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in judgment. But as the minutes ticked by, it became increasingly clear that something deeper was at play. The cold, dismissive treatment of her children could not be brushed aside any longer. Kira and Jamal, still young and full of excitement, had not fully grasped the weight of the situation, but they could tell that their mother wasn't happy. Kira, who had been trying to entertain Jamal with a book, now sat quietly, sensing the tension. Jamal's once bright and energetic demeanor had dimmed, and he too was more subdued, glancing at his mother for reassurance. Mrs. Thompson looked at her children, their innocence shining through despite the growing discomfort they were facing. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit back and allow them to feel like they didn't belong. As a mother, it was her responsibility to ensure they were treated with respect, especially in a place they were supposed to enjoy. The thought of them feeling small and unimportant hurt her deeply, but it also fueled her desire to take action. Feeling the growing frustration, Mrs. Thompson made the decision to speak up. She stood up and motioned for the flight attendant to approach. Her heart was pounding, but she was determined. This wasn't just about her children. It was about standing up for what was right. The flight attendant approached, her eyes flicking briefly toward the children before meeting Mrs. Thompson's gaze. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice still cool and distant. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady but firm. "There's been some behavior that I find troubling, and I think it needs to be addressed." The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. She glanced around the cabin for a moment before responding with a clipped tone. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. I'll let my supervisor know." She turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Thompson standing in the aisle, feeling a mix of relief and nervous anticipation. Mrs. Thompson returned to her seat and took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She looked down at Kira and Jamal, who were both watching her closely. "Don't worry, sweetie," she said to Kira, forcing a reassuring smile. "Everything's going to be fine." But the truth was, Mrs. Thompson wasn't sure. She wasn't sure if the supervisor would take her concerns seriously, or if the flight attendant would just brush it off as nothing. What if she was overreacting? But deep down, Mrs. Thompson knew she wasn't. She had seen the way her children had been treated, unfairly and with no reason at all. A few minutes passed, and the flight attendant returned with a supervisor in tow. The supervisor, a calm-looking man in his early 40s, approached the family with a neutral expression. Mrs. Thompson could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her as the supervisor spoke. "Ma'am, I understand you have a concern," the supervisor asked, his tone professional, but with a hint of curiosity. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment. She looked at the supervisor and, with all the calm confidence she could muster, explained the situation. She spoke about the flight attendant's cold attitude, how her children had been treated differently from the other passengers, and how it had made them feel unwelcome. The supervisor listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. He glanced over at the flight attendant, who was standing off to the side, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Thompson could see the change in the supervisor's demeanor as he processed her words. He didn't brush it off or make excuses. Instead, he seemed to take it seriously. "We'll look into this immediately," he said. "Please rest assured, this will be addressed." Mrs. Thompson nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time during the flight, she felt that her concerns were being heard. But she knew this wasn't over yet. There was still more to come, and she wasn't about to back down. She would make sure that her children, and everyone else who traveled with them, would never have to face this kind of treatment again. As the supervisor moved away to address the situation, Mrs. Thompson felt a momentary sense of relief. She had spoken up for her family, and it seemed like the issue was being taken seriously. But she couldn't help but feel the weight of all the eyes around her. The passengers who had been watching quietly now seemed to be murmuring among themselves. Some glanced at her with sympathy, while others exchanged looks, clearly aware of the tension that had unfolded in the cabin. For a moment, Mrs. Thompson just sat there, her hands resting in her lap, her mind racing. She had never expected her vacation to start like this. All she had wanted was for her children to enjoy a smooth flight, not to be made to feel like they were out of place. But she was also proud of herself. She hadn't backed down. Her children needed to see that standing up for what was right was important, no matter how uncomfortable the situation might be. She glanced over at Kira and Jamal. They were both unusually quiet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Kira, always the talkative one, was staring out the window, lost in thought. Jamal, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat, was clearly feeling the tension too. Just then, the flight attendant, who had been standing at the back of the plane, returned to their row, her face a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. She walked past them without saying a word, but her gaze lingered on the children for a brief moment before she turned away. Mrs. Thompson didn't let it bother her. She had already taken the steps needed to address the situation, and now she was determined not to let the flight attendant's attitude get under her skin. As the flight attendant continued her work, Mrs. Thompson noticed that the atmosphere in the cabin was slowly starting to shift. The whispers had died down, and the passengers were beginning to go back to their own business. It was clear that the supervisor's intervention had made a difference. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. However, the moment wasn't over yet. Mrs. Thompson knew that this wasn't just about her family's experience on this flight. It was about the principle of respect. What had happened was bigger than just one flight. The flight attendant's behavior had been unfair, and she wasn't going to let it slide without ensuring it was addressed properly. As the plane began to approach its destination, Mrs. Thompson found herself looking around, wondering how others had seen the situation. Had anyone else noticed? Had anyone else felt the uncomfortable energy that had settled in the cabin? To her surprise, a woman sitting 2 rows behind them leaned forward and smiled warmly at her. "I just wanted to say," the woman began softly, "I noticed what happened, and I think you handled it really well. That flight attendant's behavior wasn't right." Her words were quiet but full of sincerity, and Mrs. Thompson's heart swelled with gratitude. She smiled back and nodded, feeling the connection with this stranger. "Thank you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with appreciation. "I've been in similar situations before," the woman continued, her voice gentle. "Sometimes speaking up is the hardest part, but it's the only way things can change." Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel a sense of validation in those words. She wasn't alone. There were others who understood what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy, and that sense of solidarity gave her strength. By the time the plane began its descent, the flight attendant's behavior seemed like a distant memory. Mrs. Thompson had stood her ground, and the people around her had witnessed it. The experience hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Her children had seen firsthand that they deserved respect and that they should never settle for less. And as they prepared to land, Mrs. Thompson felt a deep sense of pride in the way she had handled the situation. As the plane continued its descent, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but replay the events in her mind. She had made the decision to speak up, and while she felt a sense of relief, there was still a lingering worry in the back of her mind. Had she done the right thing? Would the situation really be resolved? She glanced over at Kira and Jamal, who were now excitedly looking out the windows as the ground came into view. Their enthusiasm was refreshing, and Mrs. Thompson could see their spirits slowly lifting after the earlier discomfort. The flight attendants had resumed their duties, and the cabin had returned to its usual rhythm. Yet there was an unmistakable shift in the air. The passengers who had been quietly watching the exchange were now chatting amongst themselves, their voices just above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson didn't mind the attention, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of the eyes that had followed her every move. It was strange, she thought, how a simple act of standing up for her family had caused such ripples throughout the cabin. As the plane neared the runway, a flight attendant made a brief announcement, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for landing. The usual calm before the descent had returned, but it felt like everything had changed in just a short span of time. Mrs. Thompson had no idea how the rest of the passengers felt, but she could tell from their expressions that the tension had lifted. There was no longer a heavy atmosphere, and the mood had shifted to a more relaxed tone. A moment later, the supervisor returned to her row. He walked up to Mrs. Thompson with a calm, measured expression, his demeanor far more relaxed than it had been earlier. The flight attendant who had caused all the discomfort was nowhere to be seen, and Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of curiosity about what had happened in the time since their conversation. The supervisor looked at her with a gentle smile. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to personally thank you for bringing this to our attention. We've taken care of the matter, and we've addressed it with the crew. I assure you, this will not happen again." Mrs. Thompson nodded, grateful for his response. She had expected something like this, but hearing it out loud made her feel validated. She smiled at him, saying simply, "Thank you. I just wanted to make sure my children were treated with respect." "I completely understand," the supervisor replied, his voice warm. "We strive to make every passenger's experience as comfortable as possible, and I'm sorry that yours was anything less than that." Mrs. Thompson felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. She had spoken up, and the right steps were being taken. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of accomplishment. The issue hadn't been a huge conflict, but it had been important, and she knew that by addressing it, she had set an example for her children. When the plane finally came to a stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, Mrs. Thompson gathered her things, making sure Kira and Jamal were ready to leave. The children, now in a much better mood, were excited to step off the plane and begin their vacation. Mrs. Thompson, despite the earlier tension, felt a quiet pride in knowing that her children had witnessed the importance of standing up for what was right. As the passengers began to disembark, a few people approached Mrs. Thompson, offering small words of support and encouragement. "I think you did the right thing," one man said as he passed her. "That flight attendant was way out of line." Mrs. Thompson smiled and thanked him. She didn't need to hear the praise, but it made her feel like the choice she had made had resonated with others. The day was far from over, but Mrs. Thompson could already feel that they had turned a corner. She was proud of how she handled the situation, and she knew that her children had learned an important lesson in standing up for themselves and for others. As Mrs. Thompson and her children stepped off the plane and entered the terminal, the weight of the entire experience started to settle in. She had stood up for her family, and while it had been uncomfortable, she had done what needed to be done. There was no turning back now, but as the airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers coming and going, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. They were finally here, and the troubling incident was behind them. Kira and Jamal were now full of energy, excited to begin their vacation. They chattered about the places they would visit, their earlier discomfort forgotten. Mrs. Thompson smiled, happy to see their spirits lifted. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the thought of what had happened on the flight. The incident hadn't been just an isolated case. It had been a reminder of how important it was to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable or difficult. As they made their way through the airport, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but wonder what the aftermath of the situation would be. She had taken the steps to address the flight attendant's behavior, but she knew that sometimes things didn't always get resolved the way they should. What if the flight attendant would still be able to carry on with her job, unaffected by the incident? Mrs. Thompson didn't want to dwell on that thought, but it lingered in her mind as she tried to focus on the more positive aspects of their trip. Soon enough, they reached the baggage claim area. The familiar hum of the carousel and the sound of luggage sliding down to be picked up felt oddly comforting. Mrs. Thompson grabbed the suitcases while Kira and Jamal continued to bounce around with excitement. She felt a moment of peace as she realized that, despite everything, they were all okay. She had protected her children from an unpleasant experience, and they were still excited for the adventure ahead. As they waited for their bags to arrive, a man in a uniform approached Mrs. Thompson. He had a calm demeanor and wore an official-looking name tag. His appearance immediately brought her back to the earlier tension on the flight. Mrs. Thompson wondered what this interaction would be about. Was he here to speak to her about the situation? Would it be more difficult than she thought? The man introduced himself as a representative from the airline. "Ma'am," he began, his voice polite but serious, "I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened on your flight. We take these matters very seriously, and I'm here to assure you that the issue has been fully investigated." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow, surprised to see the airline taking such immediate action. She had expected the matter to be swept under the rug, but this was different. "Thank you for speaking with me," she said, her voice steady. "I just wanted to make sure that this doesn't happen again, not just for me, but for anyone else." "We completely understand," the man replied, his tone sincere. "The behavior you described is not in line with the values of our company. Rest assured, steps have been taken to ensure that this won't happen again in the future. We've already had a discussion with the flight attendant involved, and we've reviewed the situation in full." Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of relief as the man spoke. It was comforting to know that the airline was taking responsibility for what had happened. She had spoken up, and now it seemed like the situation was being addressed in a way that would make a difference. "I appreciate your response," Mrs. Thompson said, "and I'm glad to hear that the issue is being handled. I just want to make sure that my children, and everyone else, are treated with the respect they deserve." "Absolutely," the man nodded. "That's our priority, and we will continue to work toward making sure all of our passengers feel welcome and valued." With that, the man handed Mrs. Thompson a small card. "If you ever need to reach out or have any further concerns, please don't hesitate to contact us." Mrs. Thompson nodded, grateful for the gesture. It wasn't often that a company went out of its way to address an issue so promptly and thoughtfully. As the man walked away, Mrs. Thompson turned back to her children, who were now excitedly waiting for their bags. She smiled, feeling a sense of pride in the way everything had unfolded. The problem had been addressed, the airline had taken responsibility, and her family was free to enjoy the vacation they had planned. Mrs. Thompson knew that this trip would be one they would remember, not just for the fun and adventure they had ahead, but for the valuable lesson in standing up for what was right. The moment the baggage claim carousel started to move, Mrs. Thompson felt the tension from the flight start to fade away. She gathered her children close, watching as the suitcases began to appear, each one signaling that they were one step closer to starting their vacation. Kira and Jamal were already in full vacation mode, excitedly pointing out their luggage and talking about the places they'd visit. The sounds of the airport seemed to disappear as they lost themselves in the excitement of the journey ahead. Mrs. Thompson smiled, grateful that the ordeal was finally behind them. Her children were happy, and despite the uncomfortable events earlier, they were still eager to explore the world beyond the airport. But she couldn't help but think about the conversation she'd had with the airline representative just moments before. The fact that the airline had taken the time to address the situation so thoroughly gave her hope. It reassured her that standing up for what was right had made a difference, not just for her family, but for others too. As the last bag appeared on the carousel, Mrs. Thompson quickly picked it up and motioned for Kira and Jamal to follow her. They headed toward the exit, where the fresh air of their destination awaited them. They had made it through a challenging situation, and now it was time to put it behind them and focus on the fun that lay ahead. Outside, the air was warm, and the sun shone brightly, a sharp contrast to the tense moments they had experienced earlier. Mrs. Thompson led her children to the waiting taxi, where a driver greeted them with a friendly smile. The kids, still full of energy, climbed into the back seat while Mrs. Thompson slid into the front. As they drove toward their hotel, the streets seemed to come alive with new sights and sounds. It was the perfect distraction from the earlier stress, and Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel grateful for the peaceful surroundings. During the ride, Mrs. Thompson thought about what had happened on the flight. The incident hadn't been easy, but it had been important. By speaking up, she had shown her children that they didn't have to tolerate unfair treatment. They deserved to be treated with respect, no matter where they were. And as much as she had feared the situation would escalate, it hadn't. The airline had taken responsibility, and the flight attendant had faced the consequences of her actions. When they arrived at the hotel, Mrs. Thompson helped Kira and Jamal out of the taxi, and they made their way to the lobby. The hotel was beautiful, a welcoming space that felt like a fresh start after the tension of the flight. As they checked in, the friendly staff greeted them warmly, and Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was what she had been waiting for, a peaceful place where her family could relax and enjoy the vacation they had worked so hard for. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner at a local restaurant, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but reflect on the day. The challenge they had faced on the plane had turned into an opportunity to teach her children a valuable lesson. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it felt uncomfortable. It was about making sure that respect was always at the center of every interaction. She smiled as she watched Kira and Jamal excitedly talk about their day, their laughter filling the space around her. For Mrs. Thompson, this vacation had become much more than just a getaway. It was a reminder of the importance of family, of standing firm when necessary, and of the power of respect. As she listened to her children, she felt a deep sense of pride. They had handled the situation with grace, and they were now able to enjoy their time away without looking back. The vacation, despite its rough start, turned out to be a perfect escape from the daily grind. The rest of their trip was filled with laughter, new adventures, and unforgettable memories. And as the days passed, Mrs. Thompson knew one thing for sure. Her children had learned a valuable lesson, one that they would carry with them forever. Sometimes, standing up for yourself and your loved ones could change everything for the better.